We're moving in a different direction, Victor. Your services are no longer required. The words came from Bryce Calloway, a man young enough to be my son, delivered with the practiced indifference of someone who had rehearsed them in front of a mirror. He sat across the polished mahogany table of Conference Room 3, a space I knew better than my own living room. He wore a Brioni suit that probably cost more than my first car, and his Patek Philippe watch caught the cold fluorescent light. They thought firing me would be the end of the story. A simple personnel change. They were wrong. My name is Victor Stanton. I'm 54 years old. For 28 of those years, I was the senior operations supervisor at the Northridge Point Nuclear Generating Station. I didn't just work there. I was part of the concrete and the steel, the hum of the turbines a constant rhythm in my blood. I was the man who kept the lights on for 3 counties, the one who understood the soul of the machine. Bryce slid a thin folder across the table. HR has your severance package ready. It's quite generous. Standard procedure. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal effects. I didn't look at the folder. My eyes were on him. His confidence was a bright, brittle thing, the kind you see in people who have never faced a real consequence. He was all theory, no practice. He'd arrived 6 months ago, a golden boy parachuted in from the corporate headquarters of our parent company, OmniGen. His title was plant director, but his experience was in finance. He saw Northridge Point not as a complex, volatile system demanding respect, but as an asset on a balance sheet to be squeezed for higher margins. The personality dispute that led to this moment had happened 2 days before the humiliation. During a morning brief, Bryce had proposed deferring the scheduled 5-year maintenance on our primary coolant pumps. His projections, displayed on a glossy PowerPoint, showed it would save $1.2 million in the fourth quarter, boosting his performance metrics. I told him no. My voice was steady, measured. I explained that those pumps were the heart of the reactor's safety system. Deferring maintenance was a violation of NRC regulations, specifically Title 10, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 50. Appendix B. More than that, it was stupid. It was gambling with public safety for a trivial budget line. He smiled that thin, dismissive smile. I appreciate your legacy perspective, Victor, but we need to be agile in today's energy market. There's no agility in a pump seizure, I replied. There's only a scram, an investigation, and millions in fines, if we're lucky. He saw it as insubordination. I saw it as my job. He was the director. I was the one with the license. Now, in this cold room, it was over. But what Bryce Calloway, with his Wharton MBA and his talk of synergy, didn't understand was the small laminated card in my wallet, the one issued by the Department of Energy, the one that said Q clearance in stark federal letters. He saw an old supervisor he could easily replace. He had no idea he'd just fired the one component of the entire facility that was legally indispensable. If you appreciate stories about competence trumping arrogance, about the quiet professionals who actually make the world work, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I've learned that in life, just like in a reactor, some elements are critical, and removing them can have unforeseen consequences. You're going to want to see how this chain reaction plays out. I came to Northridge Point in 1996. I was 26 years old, fresh out of the Navy, where I'd spent 8 years on a Los Angeles-class submarine, the USS Helena. I knew nuclear power in a way you can only learn when you're living in a steel tube 1,000 feet beneath the ocean, with a reactor 30 feet from your bunk. It teaches you a respect for procedure that borders on religious. There is the right way, and there is the catastrophic way. There is no third option. The plant back then was solid, but aging. The first few years, I was a junior technician, mostly running diagnostics and recalibrating sensors. I worked nights, holidays, weekends. My son Leo was born in 1998. I missed his first steps because I was overseeing a refueling outage. I missed his 5th birthday party because a transformer on the main grid feeder blew during a lightning storm. My wife Sarah understood. She knew the weight of my work. She packed my lunch every day and always made sure I had a hot meal waiting, no matter what ungodly hour I came home. Over the years, I climbed the ladder. Supervisor, then senior supervisor of operations. I didn't just learn the plant systems. I absorbed them. I could tell by the pitch of a turbine if it was running a fraction of a degree too hot. I knew the specific sequence of relays that would stick in humid weather. In 2008, I rewrote the entire emergency response manual for a station blackout scenario after a near miss in Ohio gave me cold sweats. My manual became the standard for 3 other plants in our company's portfolio. I was the institutional memory, the human backup for the digital controls. The real key to my role, though, wasn't my experience. It was my security clearance. Getting Q clearance isn't like applying for a credit card. It's a 12-year journey into your own life, conducted by federal investigators with an unlimited budget for curiosity. They started the process when I was promoted to a supervisory role that required access to classified nuclear design information and materials. They interviewed my parents, my siblings, my high school chemistry teacher. They talked to my ex-girlfriend from 1990. They polygraphed me 3 times. They analyzed every dollar I ever spent, every trip I ever took, every person I ever associated with. They build a complete picture of you, looking for any flaw, any vulnerability, any secret that could be used as leverage against you. It's a process designed to find the most stable, reliable, and incorruptible people. By the time they hand you that card, the United States government trusts you implicitly with its most sensitive secrets. My mentor, the old plant director Frank Mulligan, explained it to me on the day he retired, back in 2019. We were sitting in his office, sharing a glass of 18-year-old Macallan. He was a tough, fair man who had started as a pipe fitter and worked his way to the top. "They will never understand what this clearance means, Vic," he'd said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "These new corporate guys, they see it as a line on a form, a box to be checked. To them, you're an asset. But to the federal government, you're a trusted agent. Never let them forget the difference. The plant can't legally generate a single watt without a Q-cleared senior supervisor on site. It's not a company policy. It's federal law." Frank was right. Bryce Calloway saw a 54-year-old supervisor with a Navy background. He didn't see the 12 years of federal scrutiny that made me legally irreplaceable on short notice. He didn't see the man whose signature was the only thing standing between a functioning power grid and a mandatory shutdown. The stakes were higher than just my pride. Sarah's multiple sclerosis required a specific regimen of medication, costing over $8,000 a month. Our insurance, tied to my job, covered nearly all of it. The house was just 2 years from being paid off. Leo was in his final year of a mechanical engineering degree at Texas A&M, and his tuition was due in a month. Bryce wasn't just firing an employee, he was trying to capsize my entire life. A life built on 28 years of unwavering loyalty to that plant. He had picked a fight without ever understanding the battlefield. After the 2 security guards, men I'd known for 15 years who couldn't meet my eye, walked me to the parking lot. I didn't rage. I didn't curse. A dead calm settled over me. This wasn't a street fight. It was a chess match. And Bryce had just made a rookie mistake, sacrificing his queen for what he thought was a pawn. I drove home in my 2012 Ford F-150, the one with 240,000 miles on it. I walked into the house and found Sarah in the kitchen. She saw my face and knew immediately. She didn't cry. She just wrapped her arms around me. "What do we do now, Vic?" "First," I said, my voice steady, "I'm going to make a pot of coffee. Then I'm going to read our operating license. Section 12B. My response was not emotional, it was methodical. Panic is a luxury you can't afford when you work with nuclear fission, and it's equally useless in a personal crisis. I treated this like a system anomaly. Assess the situation, consult the documentation, identify the critical path, and execute the procedure. I spent that afternoon in my study. The coffee grew cold next to me. On my desk, I had a copy of my employment contract, the Omnigen Employee Handbook, and, most importantly, a printed copy of the Northridge Point Nuclear Generating Station's operating license as issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I knew the document by heart, but I read it again, slowly, carefully. There it was, in black and white. Section 12. B. Paragraph 4. For all core critical operations, including but not limited to power, generation above 5% capacity, fuel handling, and safety system testing, a senior operations supervisor with active DOE-Q clearance must be physically present within the designated secure perimeter of the facility. It was an unambiguous, legally binding requirement, not a guideline, not a best practice, a federal mandate. Meanwhile, I could imagine the scene at the plant. Bryce was likely holding a town hall meeting in the main auditorium. He'd be standing on stage, radiating smug confidence. He'd talk about a new era of operational excellence and synergizing our talent streams. He would announce my retirement, wishing me well in my future endeavors. He would assure everyone that the transition would be seamless. He probably had the hashtags ready for his LinkedIn post. Hashtag leadership, hashtag innovation, hashtag energy future. His arrogance was his primary error. He assumed my role was modular, that one supervisor was the same as another. He delegated the task of finding my replacement to an HR department that understood compensation packages and benefits enrollment, but knew nothing about federal security protocols. They would have posted a job opening on an industry website, listing Q clearance as a preferred but not essential qualification. They would get a flood of resumes from perfectly competent supervisors who held the lower level L clearances, or none at all. He never bothered to check his assumptions. He never walked down to the records office and asked to see the NRC charter. He never considered that the quiet, graying man he saw as an obstacle was, in fact, a load-bearing wall of the entire structure. People like Bryce believe that rules are for other people, that their authority allows them to bend reality to their will. But the NRC doesn't bend. My next step was to verify the timeline. I made a call to an old friend from the Navy, Mark Chilton, who now worked in a senior administrative role at the Department of Energy. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about our kids, about the last Navy football game. Then I got to the point. Mark, I need a bit of professional insight. What's the current backlog look like for a new Q clearance investigation? I could hear him sigh over the phone. Vic, it's a nightmare. We're still working through a backlog from 2 years ago. New applications? You're looking at 18 months minimum. Could be 2 years if the subject has any foreign travel or complex financials. We're swamped. Why do you ask? Just curious, I said, thinking about succession planning. I hung up the phone. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. 18 months. 2 years. Not only could they not replace me quickly, they couldn't replace me at all within any meaningful time frame. I didn't need to build a case against them. The law was my case. My evidence was their own operating license. All I had to do was wait for reality to assert itself. The clock was ticking. Not for me. For them. The first 24 hours after my termination were quiet. I spent the day with Sarah, working in her garden. It was peaceful. For the first time in years, my phone didn't buzz with alerts from the plant. No minor sensor deviations. No requests to approve a workaround on a secondary system. The absence of that constant low-level stress was a physical relief. The withdrawal of my labor was absolute. I was no longer on their payroll. I was no longer their problem to call at 3 a.m. The chaos began, as I knew it would, with something small. On the second day, a Wednesday, a vibration sensor on one of the feed water pumps began sending intermittent anomalous readings. It was a common issue with that specific model, Sensor 7 Delta. The casing was prone to collecting condensation in high humidity, which would trip the sensor. I could have diagnosed it in 30 seconds. The fix was simple. Have a technician go down, wipe the housing dry, and reset the monitor. A 10-minute job. But the junior supervisor on duty, a good kid named Eric, didn't have my 28 years of experience. He only had the manual. My manual, ironically. And the manual, written for worst-case scenarios, stated that any unexplained vibration anomaly on a primary feed water pump required the system to be taken offline for a full diagnostic. Eric followed the book. He powered down the pump, rerouting its load to the auxiliary system. This triggered a mandatory power reduction of 15% across the entire plant, as per protocol. Instantly, the facility's output to the grid dropped. It wasn't a crisis, but it was an inefficiency, a blip on the screens of the grid operators, a loss of revenue that would have to be explained in Bryce Calloway's morning report. I heard about it from a friend in the control room who texted me that evening. 7 Delta acted up again. Had to power down for 2 hours. I just texted back, "Hope you got it sorted." The real emergency, however, wasn't technical. It was bureaucratic, and it arrived on Friday morning in the form of a man named Mr. Davies from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It was a routine, scheduled site inspection. Nothing to be alarmed about usually. Mr. Davies was a fastidious man who enjoyed finding small procedural errors. As part of his inspection checklist, he asked to see the duty roster and verify the credentials of the on-site senior staff. He'd see my name was gone. He'd see Eric listed as the acting senior supervisor, and then he would ask to see Eric's Q clearance card. Eric didn't have one. No one else on the operational staff did. The alarm bells would have gone off in a cascade. First in the HR office, then in legal, and finally in Bryce Calloway's corner office. I can picture the scene, the dawning horror on their faces as they finally read Section 12B. The frantic calls to corporate lawyers who would confirm the grim reality. They were operating a nuclear facility in direct violation of federal law. The call from the NRC to Bryce would have been brief and brutal. Mr. Davies wasn't a man for pleasantries. He would have stated the facts. "Mr. Calloway, your facility is currently in a state of Level 1 violation of your operating license. You do not have a Q-cleared supervisor on site. You are to begin immediate shutdown procedures. Power down the reactor to cold shutdown. I will remain on site to verify compliance. Failure to comply will result in an immediate and indefinite revocation of your license to operate and fines starting at $1 million per day." That was it. The emergency I knew was coming had arrived. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating force of a regulation that had been ignored. Northridge Point, the plant that had been my life's work, the beating heart of the regional power grid, was being forced to go dark because of one man's hubris, and I was the only person who could turn the lights back on. On Saturday afternoon, a black BMW M5 pulled into my driveway. It crunched on the gravel, a sound as out of place in my quiet suburban neighborhood as a gunshot. Bryce Calloway got out of the passenger side. He wasn't wearing his usual confident smirk. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped. A man I didn't recognize, an older gentleman in a conservative suit carrying a leather briefcase, got out of the driver's side. The corporate lawyer. I watched them from the kitchen window, wiping my hands on a towel. I wasn't surprised. I was ready. I'd spent the morning changing the oil in my F-150. Sarah was at her sister's for the day. It was perfect. I let them knock. I counted to 10 before opening the door. "Victor," Bryce began, trying to force a friendly tone that sounded like grinding gears. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding." I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. His expensive suit was wrinkled. He looked like he hadn't slept. The lawyer stepped forward, extending a hand. Mr. Stanton, my name is Arthur Vance. I'm with Omnigen's corporate counsel. Perhaps we could come in and have a word. I stepped aside and let them into my home. They looked around my modest living room, at the family photos on the mantel, and the worn armchair where I read the paper. They were like astronauts visiting a foreign planet. I didn't offer them a seat. It seems we were a bit hasty in our decision on Thursday, Bryce said, his voice strained. We'd like to offer you your position back. Full reinstatement, of course. We can forget this whole thing ever happened. This was the moment of reversal. The instant the entire power dynamic of the past 28 years inverted. They weren't here to command. They were here to beg. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a dropped weight. Bryce stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. No. Victor, you don't understand. The plant, we had to shut it down. It's costing the company over $1 million a day. 1.5 million, actually, I corrected him, when you factor in the penalty clauses from the Regional Power Authority for non-delivery of contracted energy. I let that hang in the air. The lawyer, Vance, took over. His voice was smoother, more practiced. Mr. Stanton, we understand you're upset, but there's a duty to the public, a responsibility. I cut him off. My duty is to follow federal law, the same law that you are currently violating. Title 10, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 50, Appendix B, as I'm sure you're now aware. Vance's expression tightened. They knew that I knew. What do you want, Victor? Bryce finally asked, the desperation breaking through his facade. What I want, I said, leaning against the doorframe, is a new arrangement. I am not interested in being your employee. My employment was terminated. If you wish to secure my services, we can discuss a contract. Vance opened his briefcase. We'd be prepared to offer a significant bonus for your return. A retention bonus. I'm not for retention, I stated calmly. I'm for hire. I have formed a consulting company. As of this morning, it's called Stanton Nuclear Solutions, LLC. My company will contract its services to Omnigen, and my company has terms. This was the moment I had been preparing for. They thought they were coming to rehire a disgruntled employee. They were about to enter into a negotiation with a sole source provider of an absolutely essential service. I held all the cards, and I was about to play them. Arthur Vance, the lawyer, was a professional. He recognized the shift in the room. This was no longer an HR matter. It was a high-stakes negotiation. Bryce just looked lost, a passenger in a crisis he had created but couldn't comprehend. Let's hear your terms, Mr. Stanton, Vance said, his voice now devoid of any false cordiality. It was pure business. I walked over to my small desk in the corner of the living room and picked up a single sheet of paper. I've taken the liberty of writing them down. I handed it to him. The first term was the nature of the engagement. Stanton Nuclear Solutions, LLC, would provide one consultant, me, to Northridge Point for the purposes of fulfilling the regulatory requirements of Section 12B. The contract would be for a guaranteed term of 24 months, non-cancelable by Omnigen for any reason. The second term was the compensation. I explained it calmly as Vance read. My previous salary is irrelevant. The plant is losing $1.5 million every day. It remains in cold shutdown. The daily cost of my consultant is $25,000. Bryce made a choking sound. $25,000 a day? That's over $9 million a year. It's the market rate for a service that only one person can provide, I said, my gaze steady. It will be paid daily, in advance, by wire transfer to my company's account by 7 a.m. each morning. If the payment is not received, my consultant does not come to the site. Vance didn't flinch. He was doing the math. $9 million a year was a lot, but it was a fraction of the cost of a 2-year shutdown, while they waited for a new supervisor's clearance to be approved. The shutdown would cost them over $1 billion. My price was a bargain. Go on, Vance said, his eyes still on the paper. Term 3, hours of service. My consultant will be on site for exactly 8 hours, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., Monday to Friday. I will not work weekends. I will not be on call. Any emergency request for services outside of these hours will be billed at a rate of $5,000 per hour, with a 4-hour minimum. I paused. Term 4, authority. While on site, my consultant will have final, non-overridable authority on all matters of operational safety. His decisions are binding. Furthermore, Mr. Calloway is to have no direct contact with him. All operational communication will be routed through the control room floor manager. I looked directly at Bryce. The color drained from his face. I had just neutered him in his own plant. And finally, I said, Term 5. My severance package from my wrongful termination will be paid in full, as originally offered. In addition, there will be a one-time resumption of service fee of $250,000. This will be paid, along with the first day's consulting fee, before I set foot on plant property. I finished. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Vance read the sheet of paper one more time, then folded it neatly and put it in his jacket pocket. This is extortion, Bryce whispered, his voice shaking with impotent rage. No, Vance said, not looking at him. This is leverage. He turned to me. I will have to run this by the board, but I expect they will find the terms acceptable. You'll have a signed contract by morning, Mr. Stanton, and the wire transfers will be made. They left. As the BMW backed out of my driveway, I felt a profound sense of vindication. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about the recognition of value. They had tried to discard me like a used part, and in doing so, had been forced to acknowledge that I was the master key to the entire kingdom. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The contract was signed. The money appeared in my new business account at 6:47 a.m. on Monday morning. I drove to the plant, parked my F-150 in my old spot, and walked past the same security guards who had escorted me out 4 days earlier. This time, they nodded with a new respect. I spent my 8 hours in the control room, overseeing the complex, multi-stage process of bringing the reactor back online. By late afternoon, Northridge Point was synchronized to the grid, and the low, familiar hum of full power operation returned. I left at 4 p.m. on the dot. Bryce Calloway was fired the following week. The Omnigen board made him the sole scapegoat for the nearly $10 million loss incurred during the 4-day shutdown. His career in strategic optimization was over. I heard a few months later that he was working as a regional manager for a shipping logistics firm in Ohio. His LinkedIn profile no longer mentioned his Wharton MBA. The HR manager who had blindly followed his orders was demoted to a junior role in another division. The enablers on the management team who had stood by and watched me get fired now had to sit in meetings where my consultant's report dictated their operational priorities. My life changed completely. The money was transformative, of course. We paid off the house. We set up a trust that would cover Sarah's medical needs for the rest of her life, no matter what. I fully funded Leo's master's and PhD should he choose to pursue them. And with the first big check, I bought a car I'd dreamed of since I was 16. A fully restored 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1, cherry red with a black interior. But the real change was the peace of mind. I worked my 8 hours. I came home. I had dinner with my wife every single night. I attended Leo's college graduation. I had weekends. I spent my Saturdays in the garage, tuning the Mustang's 428 Cobra Jet engine. My work was respected, my authority absolute. I used my position to mentor Eric and the other young engineers, passing on the knowledge I'd accumulated over a lifetime, ensuring the plant would be in good hands long after I was gone. I worked out my 2-year contract. By the end, a bright young woman whose Q clearance had finally come through was ready to take over. I trained her myself. On my last day, I walked out of the plant for the final time, not as a discarded employee, but as the man who had taught a billion-dollar corporation the true meaning of the word critical. For the first time in a long while, I walked out of a boardroom not as an employee, not as a scapegoat, but as the rightful steward of what I had built. Sometimes I sit in my garage, the scent of motor oil and old leather in the air, and I think about Bryce Calloway. I wonder if he ever understood what really happened. Some people think value is printed on a diploma or a stock certificate. They forget that true value is built over decades of showing up, of learning the things no book can teach you, and of earning a level of trust that can't be bought at any price. My 2012 F-150 still runs great, by the way. Some things are just built to last. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button and leave a comment letting me know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to do so and hit the notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. I'll see you in the next video.